As people are joining us, I would like to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us from all over the world and many different time zones. My name is Petra Dolata, and I'm an energy historian based in Calgary. And I'm particularly interested in this roundtable because I'm really interested in connecting deindustrialization and energy transitions and thinking about how discussions on the Anthropocene will also be useful to our project here. I am joining you today, as I mentioned, from Calgary, which is located on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. It's still dark here, it's 8 a.m. in the morning, but I hope I will be awake enough to chair this fourth roundtable in our Deindustrialization and the Politics of Our Time project. It's the fourth one in our series, and this one is on greening, Industrienatur, ECOLOGIZZAZIONE, VERDISSAGE. And I'm really happy to have all these wonderful contributions lined up. I have to say that Stephen High has pulled out, but I think that's okay. He's talked and presented on so many things. He was also so kind to step in when people could not make it. So it also means that our speakers have a bit more time. I will only give them the 1 minute notice at around 9 minutes. There's some housekeeping things that I would like you just to be aware of. Please make sure to mute your microphone when you're not speaking. Also, of course, remember to unmute if you want to speak. Please note this session is recorded for archival purposes, but only the speaker's presentations. So I don't have to worry, you don't have to worry about things being recorded or distributed that we are saying here and asking. During the presentations, please feel free to use the chat box to address either technical issues for general chat purposes, but also for sharing links or resources. I should also mention that we have one presentation by Lucie Morisset that will be in French, and Lauren has kindly agreed to do translations. So you should see either below or depending on what it looks on your screen, the option of closed caption. And you can click on that to follow the presentation if you're not sufficient enough in French to follow this. And I'd really like to thank Lauren for doing this because she's also presenting herself. So thank you very much, Lauren. The presentations will be followed by a question and answer session. So please save your questions for the end. You can share them then in the chat or use the raise hand option to indicate that you have a question. I know Lauren has agreed to help me, but we should also remember that she herself is a presenter. So we'll just bear with us if we might miss some people. Just be persistent and keep raising your hands or keep making sure that you're mentioning something in the chat. So with these housekeeping rules, again, welcome those who have joined us just now. We will start with Alice Ma, and I will introduce every speaker just before they speak. They have about 10 minutes. And as I mentioned, at the end, we have a lot of time for questions and answers. And I really look forward to this roundtable on, again, greening, Industrienatur, ECOLOGIZZAZIONE, VERDISSAGE. So we start with Alice Ma. She's a professor of sociology at the University of Warwick in the UK. She's the author of Industrial Ruination, Community and Place, of Port Cities and Global Legacies, and most recently, the co-editor of Toxic Truth, Environmental Justice and Citizen Science in a Post-Truth Age, which you can actually access, open access, through their project website, which you should find in the chat now. Thank you, Lauren. Because this is part of a larger European Research Council funded project on toxic expertise, environmental justice in the global petrochemical industry. And she will also present on this today. So I really look forward to your presentation here, and thank you for joining us this morning or this afternoon from the UK, Alice.
Thank you very much, Petra. As you all know, over the past half century, deindustrialization has ravaged working class communities around the world, starting in North America and Europe, where many of us are based in the 1970s and 80s, and continuing there, but also extending into South America, China, Africa, basically all around the world in later decades. The political economist Aaron Benenov has argued in his recent book, Automation and the Future of Work, that what we are witnessing is a global labor deindustrialization, which he attributes to rising industrial overcapacity rather than just due to automation, leading to a global slowdown of industrial output since the 1970s. He argues that as global industrial production has slowed down and stagnated, nothing has replaced manufacturing as an industrial growth engine for the global economy. And as the global labor population has grown, this has resulted in a lower proportion of manufacturing as a share of total employment. So this leads to a paradox facing many industrial sectors, such as one that we've been researching in the petrochemical industry: labor deindustrialization despite the presence of industry. So a case study here is the town of Grangemouth in Scotland, which is a former boom town, almost like a state-owned town of British Petroleum or BP. So in the peak in the 1970s, there were 6,000 direct employees, and it shrunk to 1,300 employees, with much more contract labor today. But actually, although there was contraction in the industry, it's actually expanded in recent years. So you can see this sort of contradiction where actually it's booming now, but not in terms of jobs. So in 2007, the petrochemical newcomer, INEOS, owned by billionaire Jim Ratcliffe, who was the richest man in the UK in 2018, bought out BP, and had a new style of corporate governance, which is basically slimming down everything for economic efficiency, flipping assets as though they were, like stocked, and ruthlessly crushing trade unions. So he sort of gloats about this in his recent biography, The Alchemists, about how they basically stood the line against the trade union, crushed their rights, and were able to lean everything up. So today, Grangemouth includes 5 of the most deprived areas in Scotland, while Jim Ratcliffe is one of the richest men in the whole world. And many of the people who we spoke to in our research were very angry about the disconnection between the past prosperity of the town and the enormous riches that they don't see. As one interviewee put it, Grangemouth has got all the symptoms of a town that industry's left it. Another resident put it, the mental health in the area has plummeted. I mean, as folks were saying about the social clubs, others were complaining that the former social club that had been provided by BP had disappeared. Even now the pubs are dead, so nobody is being brought together anymore. I mean, this is pre-COVID, obviously no one's being brought together anyway. So I'm going to make a bit of a break here now to say something a bit more provocative. So basically the nature of industrial employment has changed a great deal over the past 50 years since Daniel Bell's thesis on the coming of post-industrial society. Rather than direct unionized employees, many workers in manufacture are outsourced agency workers, contract workers, higher levels of automation. Much of the work involves higher levels of qualification, lots of work with computers and machines, complex supply chains. And the implications of continuing deindustrialization in manufacturing sectors today and in the future are thus going to be, have some similarities, but also have a lot of differences. And I think the critical juncture we're facing right now is unfolding climate catastrophe, the push to decarbonize. And this doesn't just have implications for the fossil fuel sector, but it does across all industries that will need to decarbonize in the context of unsustainable growth, we really need to reflect on the implications of this coming age, which will involve a deindustrialization in some form, although it may also involve reindustrialization. And we need to reckon with this, I think, politically, economically, given this juncture and the sense of increasing polarization and inequality as well that we've seen. So I'm going to walk through a few proposals. I think one that's interesting and sits sort of uneasily with deindustrialization is degrowth, because degrowth, I mean, in French, décroissance, it sort of means decline, and it's been misinterpreted as meaning, you know, the opposite of growth or promoting decline effectively. But really it's a social, political, ecological movement which challenges the paradigm of growth for growth's sake, of unsustainable economic growth. And it's particularly coming out of the global north and trying to advance alternative ways of living. So steady state economics, the idea that we can live well without growing, caring, ideas of commoning, ideas of things like the universal basic income as opposed to you know, just transitions where you're protecting jobs or reskilling workers. So different ways of thinking about how we might structure and think about societies. Of course, there are many criticisms of this movement, but it is very powerful and it's gaining a lot of currency, I think, as well in pandemic times about what is this unsustainable society that we're living in. What we are reaching the limits. We can see that ecologically with, you know, all these looming warnings around climate catastrophe. This links as well to a related concept, just transitions, which has actually origins in the labor movement and is more about the idea of overcoming conflicts between jobs and the environment. I think a criticism here is that it's maybe a little bit optimistic that you can just, you know, give new jobs in the green economy that will be sustainable or that will make this a smooth transition, that there's really no conflict. Whereas we've seen from research that, of course, there are real conflicts on the ground that play out. I don't know how many of you have seen the film, the short film, A Message from the Future, with Ocasio-Cortez, with this sort of, I don't know, almost utopian view about how this could happen, this way of breaking down barriers or obstacles of thinking what that future might look like, actually paying teachers and care workers fair wages, the idea that former oil workers could all be working in restoration. Like every time I watch this, it brings tears to my eyes and I can't figure out why, but I think it might be because I actually feel like not very optimistic that it could really happen. Although that's not maybe the most nice note to think about. And I think what I'm concerned about is that all of this coming age of industrial transformation is coming in the midst of unprecedented social inequality and polarization. So the visions of social and environmental justice, of just transitions, the alternative ways of living, they're so far from the mainstream and from everyday community discourses. They don't answer practical questions about how a deindustrialized community such as Greymouth, which is already stripped of its tax base, of its community resources, of capacities and solidarities would fare, and what kind of future they might expect from this kind of transition. They don't resolve systemic inequalities of racism and colonialism, and so such as land rights and social justice issues of the Wet'suwet'en peoples in northern BC, where I come from, who've been protesting over pipeline construction proposals on their unceded land. So I think it's not only a question about growth, but what kind of growth is productive or sustainable. And it's a question of collective capacity and will across what seem to be irreconcilable differences of polarized worldviews. So how can we heal these differences and do the necessary collective work to mend the future of our communities? And so I wish that I could, conclude on an optimistic rallying call, But I actually take a different direction. Maybe it's these pandemic times. A point from a recent paper by environmental scientists warning of the dire consequences of underestimating the impending ghastly future, as they call it, of ecological catastrophe, that we need a wake-up call, not just for scientists, but for social scientists and humanities scholars to ask these uncomfortable and existential questions about the future of the planet and the necessity of radical industrial transformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. You know, I'm based in Alberta. I can tell you about the discussions on existential threats and polarized discussions about, you know, decarbonization and what it does to the workforce here. So I really appreciate you beginning our discussion with this. We will now move on to Jana Golombek. And Jana, she's presented before, so you might remember her, but for those who do not know her, she works as a research associate and senior curator at the LWL Industriemuseum in Dortmund. She has curated exhibitions on the cultural history of the Ruhr, focusing on migration, the impacts of deindustrialization, and the social history of workers. Previously, she was a researcher at the Institute for Social Movements at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum and a research associate at the German Mining Museum. Are you sharing a presentation, Jana? No, okay, so please go ahead and we look forward to your contribution.
Thank you, Petra. Yeah, sorry, I'm only sharing my words today, not a presentation, but I hope that will be enough to discuss later on. Yes, I think I'm gonna present on a topic that's like on a smaller scale than Alice just did, because it's a very special and very Ruhr-centered topic, that of Industrienatur. Yeah, Petra knows what I'm talking about. And I also want to talk about how the industrial landscape in the Ruhr has become, or better, has been constructed as a cultural landscape, and therefore focus on the concept that is called Industrienatur, industrial nature, that has been quite successful in, yeah, kind of greenwashing the region's industrial heritage in the last 30 years. The word is a really neologism dating back to the International Building Exhibition, Amscher Park, and describes the vegetation that is growing on brownfields. The term functions as a label for a new perception of nature, and yeah, also as a marketing tool. Not much has been written on the topic, actually, except for a very, very great master thesis by Petra Eiringhaus, which I can only recommend. I mean, it's only in German, but maybe she will do something English as well, or already has done. I think Stefan knows more about that. But yeah, that's basically the main study on the topic, which is very thorough and great. And I can only, I don't know, present a bit of the content here. So the IBA took place from 1989 to 1999 and has already been mentioned in several workshops now, I guess. And I think it's safe to say that it was the most important restructuring program in the deindustrializing Ruhr region, and it has certainly paved the way for the success story of Industriekultur, industrial heritage, and has invented the Industrienatur concept. And yeah, the two concepts of Industriekultur and Industrienatur have to be considered as intertwined, of course. Karl Ganser, managing director of the IBA, and before that, Under Secretary of the Ministry of Urban Development in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, refers to this link, describing the Emscher Landscape Park as, quote, a new type of cultural landscape between Industrienatur and Industriekultur, unquote, and the IBA as, quote, a showcase of North Rhine-Westphalia, indeed of Germany. We have achieved development of the region for tourism, and it can now be marketed accordingly, unquote. So the Industrienatur has become a crucial tool for this marketing as well. The topic is very thematically very close to our last workshop in December on brownfields. So there's an overlap insofar as brownfields are the foundation for Industrienatur. So the negative connotations that go with brownfields function as an important counterpoint to build the success story of Industrienatur. So like polluted, ugly, abandoned, dangerous, contaminated. And they are now overwritten with words like metamorphosis, wilderness, biodiversity, reclamation, and reconciliation. And of course, words like healing, for example, and those are words that are still very often used and continue to being used in the Ruhr and in the marketing of the Ruhr related to Industrienatur. And as a prologue, I want to have a quick look at the sky before we return back to Earth. Because in 1961, Willy Brandt, who then was the SPD candidate for the chancellorship, demanded, quote, "The sky above the Ruhr has to turn blue again," unquote. So this slogan that was imprinted on the nation's memory, he coined a catchy formula that secured media attention. For example, the Spiegel made it a cover story in 1961. Many other newspapers picked up the topic. Yeah, but Willy Brandt's assessment that this task had so far been completely neglected wasn't completely true, at least not for the Ruhr, because several citizen initiatives protested against the poor conditions in different cities, and an emission protection law was in the making and was actually then passed in 1962. So I think also one of the, maybe Petra knows more about it, one of the first or the first citizen initiative was on against air pollution, and it was founded in Essen. Yeah, okay. So in the 1960s, air pollution was literally visible in the area. And millions of tons of dust, ash and soot from furnaces, steel converters and coke ovens settled on urban areas all year long. And the result was a rise in respiratory diseases, especially lung cancer, and there was a high incidence of symptoms of rickets and conjunctivitis among children. Elevated concentrations of sulfur dioxide caused trees to die and eventually led to acidification of soil and bodies of water. Of course, Brandt, by the way, was more concerned with the health issues of, although he was talking about the environment in this sentence I mentioned, he was, of course, the angle was to protect people from the pollution. The whole thing also led to certain vegetation in the Ruhr with plants and trees that was so-called Industriefest, a kind of euphemism for resistant to industrial climate. Another important term was ortsüblich, customary in a place, which was often used as an argument in court and basically meant that people had to accept the pollution because certain conditions were deemed acceptable when living in an industrial area. So many people who, I don't know, fought certain companies in court, for example, always lost because it was deemed as ortsüblich that the air was polluted and that people got sick and that trees lost their leaves and stuff like that. So that also changed, I think, in the end of the 50s. The law changed a little bit, but still it was an uphill battle. So now I want to jump back to the end of the 80s. In the late 1980s, in reaction to the environmental and social ills connected to and exacerbated by the disused mining sites and factories, the government of North Rhine-Westphalia began to plan an international competition in landscape and building design with 25 projects that would renew the Ruhr ecologically, culturally, and economically, organized under the auspices of the IBA, of course. For conceptual unification of the various projects, the IBA concentrated on the highly polluted Emscher River, a small stream that previously had been moved, straightened, canalized, and channelized, and deteriorated into a poorly functioning, stinking sewer for the industries and the people who worked in them. The cleanup of the river provided the IBA with a physical frame emblematic of its larger efforts. And in the course of a decade, numerous projects were built along the rejuvenated waterway, now resembling, quote, a long green backbone with 6 pairs of ribs leading off to the sides, unquote. But the narrative that we are interested in here is that of a transformation from an ugly desert to flourishing landscapes, basically. And in addition to the ecological renewal, the IBA also wanted to give the landscape a positive connotation and to create places to identify with, in the hope that the healing powers thus activated will spread out to include the close vicinity and more distant environs. The IBA's inventiveness has managed to inscribe multiple symbolic facets into the oxymoron of industrial nature and has produced a discourse in which semantics of decay, recapture, reconciliation, the industrial past, industrial heritage, and rural nostalgia, as well as natural aesthetics, natural romanticism, and ecological sustainability interact. A key element is the personification of nature that reclaims its hereditary place in the region, and the nature overgrows kind of the memory, and the plants replace the people. As can be seen at the Duisburg Landscape Park as the most prominent example of the IBA kind of course, in terms of Industrienatur. Designed around a disused Thyssen iron mill, Peter Latz, Landschaftspark Duisburg Nord, Peter Latz is the landscape designer, is widely hailed to be one of the most important public park projects of the last decade, fusing remnants of the former plant with innovative landscape design that integrates the historical memory of the site's abuse. The park affords visitors with the opportunity to reappropriate terrain once controlled by industry. However, emphasizing the sublime beauty of industrial ruins and highlighting individual encounters instead of the historical trajectory of economic exploitation, the design also obscures the site's social significance, thus affirming rather than contesting the destructive logic of industrial production. In many ways, Latz Park's design shares in the late 20th century, 1 minute left, okay, I'm gonna skip something. Cultural and political reapplication with memory, a turning toward the past that stands in stark contrast to the privileging of the future, so characteristic of earlier decades of 20th century modernity, as Andreas Huijsen states. Okay, I'm gonna skip that part. Yes. However, while the material preservation of the iron mill seems to address the workers and similar anxieties of obsolescence, its cultural reappropriation as an object of aesthetic pleasure constitutes less of a bastion against forgetting than a contribution to obliterating the past for the flip side of its rebirth in the realm of culture. So it seems like a disappearance of history rather. And it's nonetheless striking that residents of Duisburg-Meiderich seem to have forgotten that the natural idyll whose unblemished preservation they desire is itself the result of massive destruction. The tension between history and memory is palpable, not least because of the daunting physical presence of which is to be commemorated here. It is notable in this context that with all the emphasis on remembering the past, little efforts has been made to document the social and political history of the site or explain the plant's closure as something other than a blow of fate. Okay, skip this. The aesthetification has been and is being discussed critically, and concerns have already been raised during the EBA. National newspaper criticized that the calculated aestheticization and the limitation of the complex structure of the site of the landscape park would mock the memory of the workers insofar as the work has nearly vanished and now people who have never worked there long for this bygone age. So the focus, as Hemmings and Kagel, who also wrote on the landscape park, put it in their evaluation, the emphasis is on aesthetic pleasure with the risk of a disappearance of a sense of history, just as Tim Strangelman stated when describing the dangers of small nostalgia, or Stephen when writing about the aesthetics of ruin porn. And Pia Eyringhaus also emphasized the importance of the reconciliation narrative that implies that there was a conflict that has been solved and now there's a bright future ahead. So I want to stop here and also, I don't know, remind us as well as I did last time when we were discussing the brownfields, that we have to talk about what our role and the project or the role of our project might be in changing this, because I mean the advantage of this Industrienatur and the vast scape that are still there is that you can still insert some interpretation as well. So nothing is lost yet. Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jana, on that more positive note, as opposed to sort of the more negative that we got from the previous. But I really appreciate your contribution, also reminding us of the historical contingency of these discussions on environment, because what the example of West Germany shows is that we have a lot more discussions around pollution and health related environmental issues, which were always easier to get some buy-in from government than the more sort of climate change related and non-necessarily as directly health related. So, as environmental historians really always remind us how important it is to look at, are we talking about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s and onwards? So I think what a wonderful opening with these two presentations that really look at these very different ways of discussing this idea of greening. So I really look forward to our third presentation, and joining us from the United States is Greg Wilson, who is a professor of history at the University of Akron, where he teaches courses in the United States, Ohio, environmental and public history. In both teaching and research, he has utilized oral history and community history. His published works include Above the Shots, an oral history of the Kent State shootings, Ohio, a history of the Buckeye State, and Communities Left Behind, the Area Redevelopment Administration, 1945 to 1965. He's currently finishing a book about ketone contamination among workers and the environment in Virginia. So we really look forward to listening and hearing what your views are on this. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I guess everyone can hear me okay? I think I'm unmuted. Good. Okay. I'm going to move my screen, so make sure I get this right. And I'm going to try to read from my screen. I don't have a presentation, so it's just words. I was laughing to myself, Jana, on your presentation, because what's happening, it seems to me, is that plants are replacing plants, right? We can play with the language there. I'm going to focus on the US context here a little bit, and I'm coming at this brand new. I'm also thinking about it today, at least, from a planning and policy perspective. So kind of a bit of a top-down look at this issue, and recognizing, right, that we need to think about it in multiple ways. So I'm going to begin with an anecdote that I came across as I'm researching this. And this is from a Senate hearing here in the United States in just a few years ago. Democratic Senator Tom Udall, who is a New Mexico senator, who's very environmentally friendly to workers. He was praising the EPA's program on brownfields for making hundreds of acres ready for redevelopment, acres that he called wasted space. The program, he said, spearheaded community revitalization, economic development. He was focusing on a program in New Mexico that turned what he called a blighted area into a vibrant mixed-use space with art, museums, a farmer's market, retail shops, and office space. Now, what's interesting to me about this is that Udall is a liberal, but overwhelming support for the Brownfields program also came from someone named James Inhofe. And Inhofe is from Oklahoma. He's a noted climate change denier, very conservative, yet he was fully supportive of this Brownfields program as well, noting that it too provided redevelopment in Oklahoma, creating spaces for things like retail, art, museums, etc. So it gave me some pause to consider the fact that we have such divergent political parties, yet all of them in favor of brownfields and greening and redevelopment. So I want to think about that as a political process as we move forward. Now, greening has become quite popular in the United States, but I'm thinking about questions we want to ask ourselves as we move forward with the project. Whose perspectives are we looking at? Whose viewpoints are we seeing and hearing? Whose interests are these projects serving, right? So let's probe that. What is the relationship between greening and the socio-political aspects of the process and the ecological ones, as we've heard already? How does greening exactly connect to our project on deindustrialization, but also the politics of our time? So I've got a few ideas that I've come across in this that I'll share with you today, and look forward to some questions and discussion. So frequently what we're seeing is private as well as public and nonprofit entities all getting involved in greening what many call post-industrial landscapes to achieve various objectives. Some of this isn't new, right? We can go back to, at least in the United States, to the 19th and 20th centuries, when there were calls to create parks, playgrounds, and other kinds of initiatives in urban areas for working class neighborhoods and around industries. But today, greening really should be considered part of industrial policy. A broad term that we know, right, consists of government actions to alter the structure of an economy, to encourage resources to move into certain locations and favor certain sectors that are perceived desirable for the future, right, future development. Another aspect to consider here is regionalism, which we've heard about already today. In the United States, as in particular, right, there's a regional focus to a lot of this. It's focused on cities and what we might call legacy cities, older industrial cities. But these places face stigmas, and they face twin stigmas of both rust and pollution, right? A perception that they are working to change their identity in the face of these issues. On top of this, in the United States especially, the older industrial core of the United States is seeing a great deal of regional divergence. In other words, the two coasts are accelerating with development and wealth and power, and the central sort of industrial heartland, if you will, is not moving in that same direction. So just as we have a global divergence of wealth and power, we also have a national one, but we also have regional ones. So I think we want to think about scale that way. Many of the social problems in the United States, things like non-employment, disability, the opioid-related crisis, rising rates of mortality, and on, all of those are concentrated in this industrial area. So how will greening make an impact on these things? Will greening simply be a way to gloss over these serious issues, or can greening be a way to transform them in positive ways? So we want to think about, I think, that impact in a regional sense as we move forward here, being cognizant of these many complicated issues on the social side. Now, the other interesting part that I think we want to think about is that it allows us, greening allows us to consider how the social integrates with this environmental analysis that we're working through. We know that industrialization, that process, brought us the Anthropocene that we are now in, or that many consider us to be in. So do deindustrialized communities, are they the residues of this age? Are they the residues along with the massive terraforming across the globe and the planet, the mass extinctions, the climate crisis? I think we might consider greening then as a way to address these residues of the Anthropocene and the residues of this past in order to save the future. And I know we've heard that already this morning. The challenge then might be for communities and nations to create wealth, but also keep the Earth's climate away from a tipping point. Right? And Alice talked about that earlier. Economies are undergoing a process of structural transformation at a rapid pace, given all of these crises. And how does greening fit into this? Greening entails a so-called green economy. We have to remind ourselves that so-called green products and processes are not without risk and externalities. Making lithium batteries, for example, entails exposure to harmful materials. It generates hazardous waste that threatens the health and the livelihoods of vulnerable communities, including those hit with deindustrialization. Now, efforts by communities hit with deindustrialization to escape the impacts through greening might simply displace those impacts and shift those burdens elsewhere, thereby not escaping it, even though the performance might be to show that it has been left behind. Now, along these lines, of course, is the issue of environmental justice. In the midst of a global divergence of wealth and power, there's, of course, the divergence inside the United States and all of our nations as well. And we want to think about greening. Is it simply another form of neoliberal development that will only serve to maintain or widen these disparities? Can greening overcome them? Can there be a new pathway? And is that what we're seeing? I think we want to think about and assess that as we move forward with our research and our presentations and the politics. Now, cities, of course, as we know, have long been associated with dirt, pollution, environmental ills of industrialization. But today, especially in the United States, many of them are being lauded as the key to sustainability and the green economy. Again, city leaders have seen greening as a way to create competitive advantages. Yet, as we know, many of these are accompanied by displacement of poor and working class people. Thanks, Petra. There's a potential for those community efforts, though, to address that. But again, those are very, very difficult. The irony here is that deindustrialization, or communities undergoing greening, are attractive for gentrification. Meanwhile, industrial activity and waste are replicating patterns of environmental justice elsewhere. Again, we don't want to naturalize the disappearance of manufacturing in the working class, as we've already heard today. Past struggles, memories, lives can be erased with this greening process. So again, to conclude, these are just a few of the issues in this brief presentation here to think about. I'm thinking about the long-term integrated process of capitalism and the environment that are at work in greening, just as they've been at work in the past. Greening might be just another aspect of economic development in a so-called post-industrial world. I think we need to pay close attention to that. It can illuminate not only what we consider positive responses to issues like poverty, crime, illness, disempowerment, and the climate crisis, but it also might continue the isolation and the disenfranchisement of communities and residents who we know are often lower wage white workers, women, Native peoples, and racial minorities. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Greg. I should mention we had an indigenous group actually from the Atacama Desert, and they were telling us about how the lithium production really affects them. So I really appreciate you mentioning this. You know, there are no easy solutions to the greening. So thank you. We now have as a next speaker, Lucie Morisset. She's the Canada Research Chair on Urban Heritage, a professor in the Department of Urban and Tourism Studies of the School of Management at Université du Québec à Montréal, and a researcher at the Inter-University Center for Studies on Letters, Arts, and Traditions. She's a historian of urban planning and trained in the history of architecture and anthropology, specializing in the study of the city and its representations. And she's interested in the history of the ideas and objects that make up the built landscape. More generally, in recent years, her research has focused on planned industrial towns and cities and the role of heritage in local development, particularly in the context of deindustrialization. Lucie will present in French. And so you can click on closed caption and Lauren will simultaneously translate for us. Thank you again, Lauren, and we look forward to your presentation. Lucie.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Petra. Thank you very much. And thank you, Lauren, for translating this and for asking me to present in French, which is obviously easier for me, but I can answer all questions in English, obviously. En fait, I'm going to say in French what most of what Jana and Greg just said in English. So. En français, il n'y a pas de concept qui correspond à l'idée de greening pour des raisons culturelles que je ne vais pas approfondir ici. En revanche, dans cette affaire de greening, hein, il y a une notion qui est sous-entendue et qui, elle, semble traverser les idiomes. Tout le monde voit bien mon écran, hein? Everybody seeing my shared screen? Yeah, okay. Cette notion qui semble traverser les idiomes, c'est en fait l'opposition, hein, on l'a dit là tout à l'heure, c'est l'opposition entre la nature qui est propre, et l'industrie qui, elle, est sale. Opposition qu'on doit probablement à Jean-Jacques Rousseau, hein, et qui se comprend assez bien à travers une représentation comme celle-ci, hein, que vous reconnaissez évidemment, qui est une représentation du paradis et de l'enfer. C'est ce que je voudrais explorer brièvement ici à partir de considérations sur le patrimoine et l'héritage industriel, peut-être héritage au sens de legacy plus que heritage, que je voudrais explorer en montrant notamment que la conceptualisation végétaliste que nous entretenons de l'environnement aujourd'hui, hein, la nature c'est vert, tandis que, je sais pas moi, l'expérience humaine c'est brun, c'est gris, hein, que cette conceptualisation se déploie en contexte de désindustrialisation, qu'elle se déploie en oblitérant, en effaçant la mémoire. Ce combat auquel je me réfère ici, il se situe surtout quand on parle de désindustrialisation, il se situe dans l'univers de la planification urbaine, hein. C'est l'univers dans lequel, Jana l'a exposé, puis il va reconnaître ce dont je parle ici, c'est cet univers dans lequel une gigantesque fonderie devient un parc géant, par exemple. C'est l'univers du greening, en somme. Or, dans cet univers, il y a déjà bien longtemps, Greg l'a évoqué, il y a déjà bien longtemps qu'on oppose l'industrie à la nature. Et l'exemple le plus stellaire, c'est probablement celui de la cité-jardin, hein, de la Garden City, comme symbole de solution à tous les maux de l'industrie. C'est cette Garden City qui a fait une recette à succès de cette figuration de la nature en tant qu'opposition à la ville dans son intégralité. En fait, l'urbanisme, comme on le connaît aujourd'hui, a largement été inventé pour mettre de l'ordre dans la ville industrialisée, hein, dans l'urbanisation, ce qui postulait en quelque sorte la vérité originelle de ce qui n'était pas urbanisé ni pollué, de la nature donc. C'est un antagonisme historique, donc, qui prédate de longtemps la désindustrialisation. Mais qu'est-ce qui se passe lorsque l'industrie cesse ses activités? Et donc, en principe, lorsque l'industrie arrête de faire ce qui la rendait néfaste, ou en tout cas ce qui la rendait en opposition à la nature verte, hein? Qu'est-ce qui se passe quand l'industrie devient une mémoire et que l'usine potentiellement devient un patrimoine? Ben, depuis que je travaille sur le patrimoine et la planification urbaine, j'ai été appelée à visiter des sites un peu partout dans le monde en quête de milieux industriels réinventés. Et ce que j'ai vu m'a étonnée parce que justement, par-delà les idiomes et les cultures, il semble y avoir un paradigme commun. La planification urbaine semble être devenue le plus grand ennemi de la mémoire et du patrimoine à l'ère de l'environnementalisme, quand, comme on dit, hein, la nature reprend ses droits. On reconquiert les berges, on reclaim la terre. L'industrie fait alors figure de péché originel. Il faut retrouver le jardin d'Éden avant le serpent et avant la pomme, quitte à effacer l'expérience humaine. L'exemple le plus probant de ce que je dis là se trouve, je pense, dans les écoquartiers. Pas tous les écoquartiers, éco-districts, hein, pas tous les écoquartiers, mais quand même un certain nombre d'entre eux, et surtout ceux qui s'identifient comme tels et qui ont paradoxalement, qui ont été rendus possibles grâce aux grandes plages rendues accessibles par le déclin des fonctions industrielles. Fonctions industrielles qui sont depuis disparues. Je vous en donne en rafale quelques exemples, ça pourra soutenir une discussion ultérieure, hein. Donc, vraiment rapidement, ici, à Victoriaville, au Québec, ça c'est le site de l'usine de sel Warwick. Plus d'usines, plus d'ouvriers, table rase. On a beau chercher ce qui a pu se passer ici avant, impossible de le trouver. Les seuls travailleurs qui restent sont des travailleurs de la construction. Je ne dis pas que c'est un mauvais habitat ou que c'est un mauvais exemple de planification urbaine, mais ce n'est pas là qu'on va trouver de la mémoire ou du patrimoine industriel. Et quand je suis allée chercher du patrimoine industriel à Malmö, en Suède, j'en ai pas trouvé non plus. Les journaux, hein, là-bas, ils écrivent que la ville est passée from a decadent industrial city to a futuristic and eco-sustainable gem. En fait, tout ce qui reste de la décadence industrielle et tout ce que ces écoquartiers prisent en commun, hein, c'est l'eau qui a donné naissance à l'industrie, hein, l'eau qui, ici, survit, mais sous une toute autre forme et avec un tout autre sens. À Stockholm, qu'on voit ici non plus, hein, dans ce qui est probablement l'exemple le plus connu d'écoquartier au monde, hein, je n'ai pas vu la trace d'un héritage industriel ou en tout cas d'un héritage industriel qui dirait son histoire et qui dirait son expérience. Encore là, je ne dis pas que j'habiterai pas là, hein, mais si on veut savoir ce qu'a été la vie industrielle en Suède, c'est pas là qu'on va la trouver. On a gardé des morceaux de reste, hein, c'est vrai, dont cette enseigne, hein, très, très, très populaire en design, les enseignes vintage. C'est comme une breloque, hein, un ornement. Mais disons que l'histoire, elle, elle reste sur le papier. Bon, croyez pas, je ne suis pas nostalgique ici, hein, mais si on pense que la désindustrialisation est une blessure, je ne crois pas que la cacher, même si on la cache sous un arbre, je ne crois pas que la cacher soit une solution. On l'a vu très brièvement à Shawinigan, hein, ici au Québec, quand on a détruit tout ce qui restait de tout un quartier autour de l'usine de la Belgo, hein, et de ce qui s'est déjà appelé Belgoville. Sur le chantier de démolition, on a entendu le maire dire aux nouvelles, il a dit « Le meilleur héritage qu'on peut laisser aux gens, c'est le bord de l'eau. Je vois un petit Silicon Valley avec des constructions modernes et vertes, un aménagement paysager, une piste multi-usage, enfin, etc. » Il dit, ce maire, on récupère notre nature, on récupère ce qui est à nous. Je vois du monde qui fait du kayak. Enfin, vous voyez le portrait. Mais tout ça, ce n'est pas la vie de tout le monde. Je vous en donne un extrait. Est-ce que vous entendez le son? Vous n'entendez pas, hein? Ce que vous devriez entendre, donc, c'est cet ouvrier qui dit « c'est vraiment pas évident, on voit tout qui disparaît, ça fait 100 ans que tout ça s'est passé, puis maintenant, il ne reste plus rien. » Bon, évidemment, il y a des contre-exemples de tout ça. À Canberra, par exemple, en Australie, hein, on a converti tout l'ancien secteur industriel en capitalisant sur une ancienne centrale hydroélectrique qui est à la fois devenue l'icône et le cœur battant du quartier. Le cœur battant, en effet, parce que c'est là que les anciens occupants et les nouveaux habitants se reconnaissent dans ces glassworks, donc. Et dans une toponymie aussi qui ne perd pas une occasion de dire d'où elle vient. Mais on ne parle pas d'écoquartiers à Canberra précisément, et je pense que ce n'est pas un hasard. Parce que les écoquartiers sont non seulement un symptôme de quelque chose de plus profond, je pense qu'entre le patrimoine et l'écologie, on a affaire à deux vertus qui s'opposent, comme deux aimants mis du mauvais côté, hein. Dans une perspective, thank you Petra, dans une perspective téléologique qui présente l'environnementalisme comme l'aboutissement logique du progrès humain, hein, l'héritage industriel, c'est un reste gênant. Surtout quand on pense que le patrimoine n'est qu'un ornement, comme une enseigne dans un coin. On substitue donc la vertu du greening, hein, de la restitution écologique, on la substitue à la conservation patrimoniale, qu'on voit aussi comme une vertu. Personne, de fait, n'oserait déplorer la perte du patrimoine si on gagne en écologie. Dans la ville désindustrialisée, le greening devient donc un procédé de nettoyage, hein, c'est ce que Jana a dit aussi, un procédé d'aseptisation sémantique. Évidemment, ce faisant, on ignore que le patrimoine est aussi une dynamique urbaine et un facteur de continuité. À choisir entre deux vertus, on préfère donc l'oubli à la thérapie, en quelque sorte. Un des exemples les plus patents qu'on a vu récemment, c'est le choix de la ville d'Asbestos au Québec, hein, ici, de changer son nom pour Val-des-Sources. La ville a changé de nom. Mais un site urbain désindustrialisé, ce n'est pas seulement un vide à remplir, c'est, je pense, aussi un plein à comprendre, à prendre avec. Mais pour ça, je pense qu'il faut éviter de se laisser prendre, et c'est ce que je voulais évoquer un peu, de se laisser prendre par la surface des mots. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Lucie. This was very insightful, and I'm reminded, I think, also talking about reclamation and the politics of reclamation and how it interlinks with discussions on gentrification and all this will be something that is another sort of sub discussion that we need to include here in our discussions. I'll just bring one more example from Alberta, where we have huge discussions, political discussions on reclamation, because a lot of the oil industries are not cleaning up and abandoning wells. So we have major discussions that revolve around that. And I really appreciate your, the juxtaposition and the semantics of the green versus the brown, and that this is historically preceding our discussions on deindustrialization. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hopefully this gave enough time to Lauren. I wanted to give you a little bit of a breather. Thank you again. I really appreciate you doing this for us. You all know Lauren as the Associate Director of our project, Deindustrialization and the Politics of Our Time. She's a graduate student at Concordia's Center for Oral History and Digital Storytelling. And her work focuses on deindustrialization in the apparel manufacturing industry in Montreal, with particular attention to the gendered and racialized impacts of economic change, gentrification, and the politics of deindustrializing space. So thank you very much, Lauren, and we look forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Petra. I am going to try and share my screen here. I have a little presentation. Oh, sorry, I'm just trying to figure out a way where I can see my notes at the same time. One second. Oh. Sorry about that. I think
No
that
worries.
What may need to happen is that I just use it in the kind of unglamorous, not full screen, because it like separates the display so that I can't actually see my notes. So I'll see if I can make this look somewhat. Okay, let's try this again. Sorry, everyone.
Not to worry. While you work on this, thank you, Eric, for your chat contribution. If you haven't seen this, everyone, I think that's a very useful source as well. Thank you.
Okay. Is everybody okay with just looking at this? I'm sorry. Okay, so I'll get started. So what I'll be presenting on today is greening, urban industrial displacement, and gentrification. And I'll just very quickly present a little bit on my research, because it follows kind of two slightly different but related strands. So the first one is on gendered experiences of deindustrialization in the garment industry. And this is a project that's very much rooted in oral history. And I'm particularly interested in the impacts that it has on women's non-wage work lives and the labor of social reproduction. But kind of the second stream of research is on this idea of the politics of deindustrializing space, gentrification, and financialization. And so obviously this presentation is really coming out of this second stream of research. And today I'll be presenting on the role that greening plays in the displacement of industrial workplaces via residential and office space conversions. So a lot of gentrification research relates to residential displacement, but there's also a considerable body of work that shows that it's important to consider how the displacement of actual industrial workplaces contributes to this process of gentrification. So as an example, I'll be talking about Montreal's garment district primarily, which is also commonly referred to as Chabanel. It's really located in the middle of the island of Montreal, and it was built in the 1960s, as you can probably tell from the architecture. And this was following several boom years in the garment industry as kind of a new center for apparel manufacturing firms in the city. This location was chosen largely in reaction to suburbanization and shifts in transportation networks, so away from rail lines and the deindustrializing Lachine Canal, which is in the southwest of Montreal, in favor of the newly built Autoroute 40, which is kind of one of the main highways that runs through the city. By 1971, the Canadian government developed its textile trade policy to really intervene directly in the process of deindustrialization through progressive trade liberalization. And so over the next 30 years, most of the garment manufacturers would close in the area. And by the 90s, the massive industrial buildings had very high vacancy rates. But none of these buildings were ever considered to be brownfield sites, though. Rather, their changing uses really reflect shifts in the global division of labor. So as many garment manufacturers turn their operations to importing clothing from the global south, they also turned toward the marketing and design of apparel. The massive size and wide open floor plates of these industrial spaces also became conducive to what Christine Willey has termed para-industrial uses. So industries that need a lot of space, but operate with very low labor intensity, like storage, warehousing, and more recently, too, firms engaged in logistics and distribution have taken up residence in the area. In 2005, a property developer called Groupe Diane went on a buying spree, acquiring 5 of the buildings with the Canadian Public Service Pension Fund as an investment partner. And as of the early aughts, the area attracted successive waves of plans for its revitalization. Now, as a side note here, and a very interesting side note for me, is that Groupe Diane is primarily made up of former owners of garment manufacturing companies. So there's also a high degree of continuity between capital in the now mostly deindustrialized garment industry and this kind of new order of real estate capital. Now, what's resulted is a concerted effort to rebrand the area to attract high fashion designers, tech companies, engineering firms, and banks through the conversion of these kind of big, wide open industrial spaces into office spaces and residential condos. Now, greening really fits into this rebranding strategy. So one of the most striking examples of these greening strategies, for me at least, is actually just one street corner, the corner of Esplanade and Chabanel, at this newly minted park and condo conversion. So the park, which was completed with an investment of $3 million from the municipal government, is named after fashion designer Jana Monahan. And actually just across the street from this park, we also see the condo conversion, which is called La Fabrique 125, which translates to kind of the factory. And this condo conversion's aesthetics supposedly reference the industrial heritage of the area, with the sequential numbers meant to represent stitching on a garment, apparently. And the residential conversion also boasts quote unquote sustainable development principles, including a green roof and a recycling program. So here, greening takes place in 2 ways. First, through the conversion of green spaces, and second, through practices of greenwashing. So particularly troubling for me, at least, is this idea of greenwashing, which very broadly refers to the kind of false presentation of a company's activities as being environmentally friendly or sustainable by essentially misrepresenting their operations or overstating their impact. So if we look more closely at Groupe Diane's sustainability policy, we can see that their policies aren't particularly radical from an environmental perspective. So the vast majority of them is recycling programs, which are very much the norm here in Montreal and have been for decades. And what they consider to be a green roof, just go back one slide, is this little patch of grass right up here. I think that I'm referring here to an article, an op-ed actually in the Montreal Gazette, where I think the critique of this kind of sustainable development discourse is elucidated particularly clearly, and this was a piece by Norma Rantisi, Danielle Kerrigan, and the other person's first name I don't know, but their last name is Gay. And it's that a focus on eco-responsible infrastructures really deflects attention away from social concerns around particular projects. Now, to be clear, this isn't to say that sustainably designed infrastructure projects are bad. We are living in an environmental crisis, and obviously this question needs to inform building conversions at the very least. The point here is that emphasizing sustainable design is an effective tool, or an extremely effective tool, I would argue, to cloak projects in legitimacy and positive value judgments, essentially deflecting attention away from social concerns like gentrification and industrial displacement. Wynne Curran has argued that deindustrialization has led to the creation of what she terms gentrifiable landscapes, and that globalization and deindustrialization essentially provides the economic rationale for the removal of certain people and certain uses from urban space. But gentrification is not only linked to the displacement of industrial uses, but also, she argues, to the degradation and the informalization of the blue-collar work that remains in these areas. And this is certainly true for the garment industry. Although there are still large manufacturing operations in the area, most of these jobs are not unionized, when at one point unionization rates were over 70%. And as the industry massively deunionized, there was a marked increase in subcontracting as well as homeworking, which are both highly precarious and poorly remunerated labor regimes in contrast with formerly unionized positions. And I'll conclude here with just one last point, and it's that I would also argue that greening discourse around deindustrializing spaces is closely related to what Kathy Stanton refers to as the performance of the post-industrial. So Stanton argues that these performances are particularly visible in placemaking strategies that actively seek to construct places and experiences as products in themselves with the goal of attracting capital. And this is closely related to, of course, what Lucie was arguing in her presentation. It's that by contrasting the new kind of sustainable, quote unquote, future with the old industrial past, placemaking strategies effectively conjure up this so-called industrial present. So I'll end it there. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Lucie. Thank you very much as well to Alice, Jana. Sorry, thank you, Lauren. I'm apologies. Thank you also, of course, to Alice, Jana, Greg, and Lucie for your presentations. I'm just gonna start